as always, for the surprises in every introduction, but also just for the spirit of hospitality that is here at Malaprops. This partnership truly is special for UNC Press, and I'm so privileged to be part of it. As Patricia mentioned, I'm a member of the UNC Press Advancement Council. And I just wanted to spend a moment telling you a little bit about the press, its work, before making the introduction of our very special authors this evening. For over a century, the UNC Press has been publishing award-winning books for the Academy and for the people of North Carolina and the region. UNC Press publishes books, about 125 books every year, or that translates to one every 2 or 3 days. Whether a scholarly monograph or a title intended for general audiences, each UNC Press title undergoes a rigorous peer review process, a hallmark of university press publishing. So these are quality books. Well over half win awards each year, awards such as the National Book Award, the Pulitzer Prize in History, and the Bancroft Prize, just to name a few. Affiliated with our great public university system, the press serves the people of the state by publishing general interest books on North Carolina and the American South, books that explore the history and culture of this region. This evening's books are 2 such titles. In my mind, no other institution does what UNC Press does for North Carolina. Through its numerous awards and reviews, its amazing catalog of titles, and its sterling reputation, the name of the press is carried throughout our state, throughout the region, and indeed around the globe. And in an age of alternative facts, the press can be counted on to deliver reliably trustworthy books. This evening, we are in for a special treat. 2 authors who work with the UNC Press in conversation with one another. Elizabeth Engelhardt is Kenan Eminent Professor of Southern Studies in the Department of American Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, as well as Senior Associate Dean for Fine Arts and Humanities in the College of Arts and Sciences. A scholar of Southern and Appalachian food and culture, she is the author or editor of 8 books, including The Food We Eat, The Stories We Tell, Contemporary Appalachian Tables, and most recently, the book she'll be discussing this evening, Boardinghouse Women, How Southern Keepers, Cooks, Nurses, Widows, and Runaways Shaped Modern America. She co-directs Southern Futures, a campus-wide initiative for equity, justice, and possibility, based in the arts and humanities and organized as a collaborative network for the students, scholars, creators, and community leaders doing extraordinary work to reimagine the American South. Elizabeth grew up in Western North Carolina, where her family roots stretch back centuries. Diane Flynt is author of Wild, Tamed, Lost, Revived, the surprising story of apples in the South. She is a multiple-time James Beard Award finalist for Outstanding Beverage Professional. In 1997, she moved to a farm in the Virginia Blue Ridge Mountains, where she founded Foggy Ridge Cider, the first 20th century cidery in the South. Foggy Ridge produced cider from 2004 to 2018 and has been nationally recognized. But as Diane is fond of saying, we all have many lives in us. Her own path is proof of that. Diane began her career as a banker, then worked as a road warrior consultant. Then she turned her life to farming, growing apples and making cider. Then she set out to write this book. She speaks on cider, farming, and food culture in national and regional forums. And if my speech seems slurred, it's because I was sampling some of the cider she was discussing today. I'm such a fan of both books, truly, each of which tells untold and undertold stories that deserve to be told. And both are so beautifully written. What an honor it is to welcome Elizabeth and Diane. and to turn the program over to them now.
Well, thank you for that warm welcome, both of you. And I'm so excited to be in an independent bookstore. All of you in Asheville are so lucky to have Malaprops. I think of bookstores like this as sacred places. And my husband says I'm like a drunk going by a bar. I can't miss one whenever I get near. And in Indy, I like to go in.
I'm so happy to be at this one. I had a high school friend reach out to me when he saw the announcement of this event. He's up, and we lost him to the Northeast right now, so he's not here this evening, but he reached out to me and said, I remember how hard we had to work to get from Hendersonville to Asheville, to get to Malaprops, and to get a book. And I loved it, and I am so glad you're there, and I'm just thrilled to be here, and I'm so glad Malaprops is still here.
And we've planned a back and forth discussion. We hope you read both books, so we're not going to read them to you. We will appreciate your feedback on both of them, so please stay in touch with us. I hope this isn't our only meeting, but we thought it would be useful to start with talking about the genesis of our book. And Elizabeth tells a story early in hers that really caught my imagination. So would you tell that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So as an academic, we often get organized and go to academic conferences, and it's a time to try out new ideas and learn what other people are working on. And sometimes they are very, very boring. And other times you get a little brigadoon of a conference. And so I was at a conference actually down the road at Converse College. It was called the Okra to Opera Conference, and it was about Southern culture and material culture. And we were staying at what turned out to be a boarding house. And it was a former large-ish home. It was sort of like a bed and breakfast, but it still had people traveling who would stay regularly there for a couple of weeks. It had folks who would just stay a night. It had folks who were staying a long period of time. And in the midst of the conference, at whom just an amazing cast of characters were there. We were in great conversations. It wasn't a presentation. We just ended up in conversations. And my friend Becca Sharpless and I, some of you may have read her book that also came out from UNC Press recently on Southern baking. I recommend it too. She and I started talking about, well, wait a minute, of those Southern first published cookbooks, it turns out that most of them were written by boarding house keepers, and no one had noticed that. No one had written about that. So Melinda Russell, who wrote the first published cookbook by a Black woman that we know of, she was a boarding house keeper in Cold Springs, Tennessee. She learned from the company of women who cooked in Mary Randolph's kitchens. Mary Randolph enslaved them, but they cooked in her kitchen, and they created a plan that was called the Virginia Plan. So then Mary Randolph was also a boarding house keeper, and she wrote the Virginia Housewife, a very early published cookbook. And we just started listing them out, and sort of said, well, somebody ought to write that book. Should we write that book together? Who can do that book? Let's think about that book. And so Becca went down the direction of, I'm going to explore what they were cooking, and particularly that story of baking. And I went in the direction of, well, maybe we could look into what was so particular about the boarding house, and how did people write cookbooks out of it. And then I had something happen that has happened to me more than once. And Diane, I think this maybe comes over to you and your experience of your book also, which is that as I started researching boarding houses, I happened to look in one of our US censuses, because I was kind of circling around Western North Carolina for some of the story. And I looked up my own family. And I knew that my mother every once in a while would say something about how when she was very young, she remembered the plant in Brevard being built, And her father was one of the people who helped build the plant. And she remembered there being some extra people there and some extra laundry, and some other folks who were building that plant stayed there for a short period of time. But that's as far as the story went. And so I was really shocked to find when I opened up the census that not only had my grandmother reported her occupation as boarding house keeper, but then she said that she made as much money as he did that year. And she worked 52 weeks of the year, which absolutely she did. And so I thought, well, there is a lot more to this story. I didn't know I had that family connection, but it also just reminded me to say, what's here and how do we find it? Diane, I think you had a kind of wandering path into your project also. Can you talk about the very beginning of it?
I can, and it definitely was wandering. I like to begin with place because that's what drove a lot of my own exploration. You know, I live in the Southern Appalachians, but the Virginia version, and we're about the same climate as Asheville, up on the Blue Ridge Plateau, about 3,000 feet elevation. And our whole area is what our friend and cookbook author Ronnie Lundy calls Appalachia. And this time of year, if you know what an apple tree looks like, the silhouette of apple trees, it's just unmistakable. You can spot it from a fast moving car. And apples are everywhere. In the fall, they roll across the road. It's just practically a road hazard. And in the spring, they just paint the fence rows and the roadsides, not just established planted orchards, but just wild seedling trees. So what I learned as I became an apple grower, I learned so much about apples from my friend and mentor, Lee Calhoun. Lee was a nurseryman. In his second career, he had an important apple tree nursery in Pittsboro, North Carolina, and operated that until the late 90s, and wrote a book called Old Southern Apples. And it is the Bible for people like me and people like William and others who care about ingredients. It's an encyclopedia from I think, I can't remember what the first apple was, all the way to Z. And he explores not just what the apple looked like and how it tasted, but he was the first person to write about Southern apples and give you a little snippet of history. Some of the gems, like Elizabeth just talked about boarding houses, he discovered those gems about Southern apples. And my idea, I just felt like there was more there. You know, these apples were everywhere. Lee taught me that what you may not know is that for about 300 years, apples grew everywhere in the South. From Mississippi, one of the most important nurseries was outside Greenwood, Mississippi. Mobile, Alabama exported apples to northern states for 80 years. The most important nursery in the 19th century was in Augusta, Georgia, outside of Augusta, Georgia. The second most important one was outside of Columbia, South Carolina. So places that you don't think of as apple central were in fact central to apples in the South. And Lee told snippets of stories about these apples all over the place. And I just wanted to dig deeper. I knew there was more there than a couple of lines. And to tell you why, I'll have to talk about sex. Should I do that now? Okay, so I should do that now. So apples are like humans, they're heterozygous. So when apples reproduce, the seed of the apple, which is the offspring, is the combination of the DNA of two parents. So think about an apple, cut it around the equator, pop it open. There are usually six carpels, those little hard capsules. And inside each carpel is usually 2 seeds. You plant those 12 seeds, you will get 12 brand new apples to the universe. And you're thinking, well, why come there all these piles of Golden Delicious and Granny Smith in the grocery store? That's replication. Reproduction is sexual reproduction. Replication is cloning. Humans have known how to do that for 2,000 years. That's grafting. So apples captured me and made me want to find out those stories, because each one is tied to human. So each apple that has a name, that means that someone observed something about that apple, was a noticer, like Elizabeth and her colleagues noticing the boarding house, and said, well, you know, this apple ripens in June, and I really like fruit in June, so I'm going to replicate this. I'm going to graft it. I'm going to name it the Disson apple or the Flynt apple. That's how we got 2,000 apple varieties in the South that were either originated here or widely grown. And so each one of them is connected to a person and therefore carries a history.
So I might talk about sex also,
Okay.
but not quite yet. So thinking about that storytelling, one of the things, Diane is such a generous person, and I was sitting in my office at UNC Chapel Hill one day, and she called me and said, I need some help. I want to solve a problem. I want to solve a problem for my mentor, Lee Calhoun. We need to figure out what to do with his papers. And so then I called up our friends in the Southern Historical Collection at Wilson Library on the campus of UNC Chapel Hill and said, I need your help in solving a problem. We need to find something to do with this. And they agree, as we all do, about just the value of Lee's collection and his work. And so we were able to acquire those papers, bring them to Wilson Library, and then Wilson was very kind and let my senior Southern Studies students play in those archives before they were even accessioned. And one of the things that they did was just really dig into the notebook that Lee left of all the stories that people wrote in and told him about their apples. And it makes the point that Diane is saying here. We were able to then have a reception that Lee was able to attend. And it also became a conversation with UNC Press about we ought to do something more with this. And so Diane, when you started then turning your adventures, turning what you had learned, turning your curiosity about that storytelling into a book, what'd you do?
Well, first of all, I had two wise women, one on each shoulder, Elizabeth Engelhardt and Marcy Ferris, and they were whispering in my ear, and they were at my beck and call whenever I hit a roadblock, and I couldn't have written this book without the two of you. So thank you very much. You know, as a farmer, what you do every day is to notice the world around you, is to notice what's happening with your ingredient that you're growing, to pay attention to it. I'm that way naturally. I grew up in a family very connected to the natural world, and my father was was very instrumental in my being so connected to the world around me and paying attention to it. I think writing is the same thing. It's digging deep. It's following trails, you know, being a bit of a detective and not accepting the surface story. One of the things that struck me about apples is that so many of the stories were so obviously heavily mythologized. You know, the apple seed in the gullet of the snow goose. I mean, it's been told so many times, and it is just not true. I mean, it's just not true. So I guess as humans, we want these tidy stories and these kind of gauzy stories, but I really wasn't interested in that. I was interested in the real story. And sometimes that story is not an attractive one. It has a lot of pain associated with it, or violence, as in the case of the Indian Removal Act, which I'll talk about, the expulsion of indigenous people from the South is very closely tied to apples. But it's real. And unless you tell all sides of it, you don't have that real experience. And when I read your book, Elizabeth, I just was blown away by so many of these gems of like communes and runaways and all of these things associated with Boardinghouse Women. Will you tell us about some of those?
Yes, so I made a promise earlier. I have to get back around to it, don't I? But that piece, your phrase about surface stories and how much we need to dig under those is so important. There are a lot of myths about boarding houses also. The food is terrible, right? The boarding house reach, there's not enough, it's stingy, it's just glop, right? It's hash, boarding house hash. There are a million songs, a million stories about how terrible that was. When I really started to dig in, I found a couple of things. One is that storytelling, that I like apples that are good in June, that, hey, I really, this is the food that I want. I end up making a claim in the book that in part, Southern food was invented in boarding houses. Now, of course it wasn't. Of course, people were eating across the US South for long periods of time. They continue to. There's lots of ways that Southern food coheres as a cuisine. It comes together. But boarding houses played a role because people asked for it. They left their home. They were in a space that was not their home space, but was still kind of like home. And they started saying, I want a particular kind of food. And so those boarding house keepers who end up writing those cookbooks, it's in part because they've started to cohere around what are these flavors, what am I asking for? But then when you dig a little further, things that happen in those boarding house spaces turn out to be not only about food, and they are about those moments of violence and enforcement. Are you the right class? Do you know how to behave yourself? Are you trying to pass? Are you trying to get above how you were raised? They can be about safe spaces when people are fleeing from places that, families that didn't work for them, jobs that didn't work for them, when they're trying to get to new towns. They can be your last resort for nursing and care if you don't have those family connections. They also can be a place where people are just in intimate relation to each other. They might be learning how to drink. They might be learning how to think about romance. They might be learning how to participate in, let themselves be seduced in the boarding house. There's all kinds of stories about that as well. And so when you let it be a little messy, when you don't go into a project knowing what you're going to find, but you allow the wandering around a little bit, then I think the subject can really open up and you can let yourself be surprised.
One of the things I liked about your book was how you brought to life stories that you didn't have a lot of material to work with. And I found that with apples, apples were chosen by Southerners, by enslaved men and women, by indigenous people, by small farmers. And of course, most of the information is in, with the aristocratic, the presidential apple growers. You can read a lot about, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and their orchards, but not so much about others. How did you do that? How did you bring to life people for whom there is not much historic documentation?
I think you have to do that really carefully, and you need to do it really humbly, because there are some stories that have been hidden for a reason, that it's not safe to tell them. It's not it's not my role to tell them. There are some stories that need to be told and the breadcrumbs are there. And I think that I'm really thinking about slowing down, reading through the lines, seeing what's between the story. I think sometimes you have to go ahead and tell the story even if you don't have all the pieces. I've always felt like a book is the beginning of a conversation. I hope that that's where we land here in this today, because I want to hear your stories about boarding houses. I think that in some of the stories that we can tell, getting on the page begins the conversation. We can find out more about it. So for instance, so in Transylvania County, one of our most important residents in Transylvania County was Loretta Aiken, Mom's Mabley, Jackie Mabley, who, ended up really having a career all over the United States, all over the world, spent the later parts of her life in Harlem, but began in Brevard, was born in Transylvania County, lived in Transylvania County early in her life. And so I was writing a chapter where I was talking about what it meant that boarding houses in the US South survive longer than they do in other parts of the country. Part of that was because of Jim Crow. You couldn't just walk into every hotel and get a room, depending on your religion, depending on your race, depending on people's assumption of those things. You might not be able to travel safely across the US South. And so boarding houses stood in as a place where you could, in fact, have a place to stay. And so that was kind of a beginning of, oh, this is a role for boarding houses. This is a role of what they continue to do. But then I started thinking, well, who else is passing through and using boarding houses for safety, for travel? And in thinking about that, then we live in a moment where, Diane, you and I both wrote books during the pandemic, which is not an easy time to write a book. But we live in a moment where it's very...
We got a lot more done than buying a puppy.
That's true. But we do have access to an amazing collection of digitized newspapers. And in those newspapers, it turns out there are a lot of stories of people who almost found safety in a boarding house, but not quite. Some of them were trying to flee to a different community and change their class. Some of them were had lived life wearing men's clothes as a man for a long period of time, but their trunk still had some women's clothes in it. And the police were really concerned about why that was the case. Some of them were part of the Underground Railroad and trying to get out of the US South in an earlier era where it was very unsafe to do so. But you know what? There's all kinds of people hanging around in the hallways of the boarding house. Who is whom? And that could be a place where you could be. We don't know the names of all of those people. Someone does. I don't know the names of them, but I can nonetheless say there's something important in this newspaper. There's something important in this fragment. And I think you went down a similar pathway in trying to think about what are those nursery documents, those nursery records that are sometimes very fragmentary, but there's a piece in there that you could excavate and then put in conversation with other.
And we talked about perhaps touching on what surprised us most in our research. I grew up in Georgia in a small town, West Point, Georgia, south of Atlanta. And the very truncated, you had to take a year of Georgia history to graduate from high school. And it was, 8.5 months on the Civil War and 3 sentences on the Trail of Tears. That was about it. And I knew from understanding how apples arrived in America, and apples are not native to America. I maybe talk about that later if anybody's interested in getting into biology. But I knew that indigenous people were great farmers and grew apples very early before settlement, especially in the mountains. But I didn't know much about the role of indigenous groups in growing apples. And as I dug into that, I've learned so much that was just an eye-opener. But then I also learned how much is just blank, is that we perhaps will never know, or certainly won't know the whole story. And perhaps I'll just tell that Georgia story a little bit. And so I dug deep into the role of the Cherokee in growing apples in Georgia. They were great apple growers. And we know so much about their orchards because of what happened with the 1836 Indian Removal Act and the violent expulsion of Cherokee people and some Creek from Georgia, from North Carolina, and from eastern states. One thing I learned that reminded me of today and how closely divided our country is today is that the Indian Removal Act passed the U.S. House of Representatives by 5 votes, 97 to 104. So we were not unified in that very violent decision. So after the Cherokee were removed from the land they'd occupied for many years, federal valuators came into Georgia and valued their possessions because those were going to be auctioned or given to white Georgians. And they counted things like cooking utensils, pots and pans, bowls, looms, cradles. They counted the oxen and the horses, and they counted the orchards, and they counted the apple trees. So we know through the research of people like Claudio Sant, a professor at University of Georgia, who wrote a great book called Unworthy Republic, published a few years ago. Wonderful book if you want to delve more into that history. He has deciphered those federal valuator records. He thinks many of them were illiterate because their spelling was so awful and they used different spelling and their notations are very confusing. He and I have talked a lot about what some of those notations mean, but we know that the Cherokee had not just a few orchards, but hundreds. Over 2/3 of Cherokee households had mature orchards. And these were trees not grown on dwarf rootstock like we do today. These were 40, 50 foot tall trees. A small orchard would be 30 or 40 trees. Major Ridge, who is the largest Cherokee landowner, had 1,000 peach trees and 500 apple trees. After Indian removal, a Georgia nurseryman named Jarvis Van Buren went into Cherokee territory and gathered grafting wood from those apples, and he replicated them and introduced them to the nursery trade. So today we can taste apples like Kulisaga and Kitagiski and Junaluska, but we don't know their original names. He chose place names, Cherokee place names. They were his choices. He occasionally named one Mountain Bell. It's early season apple. So we know what those apples are, but we don't know why they are. We don't know their place in the culture of the Cherokee people. We don't know what they were called or how they were used. We don't know who chose them, who noticed them. And I'm not sure we'll ever know that.
So Diane, one of the things that I learned from you every time we sit down and we talk about apples and we get really lost in them, but one of the things that I always appreciate is that you bring it around to why should we care? Why do apples matter? What are we going to know about ourselves and about this moment and about those places where you began if we pay a little bit of attention to apples? Can you talk about that a little bit for everyone else?
Sure, I can, and I'll use the example of family apples. The South has more family apples than any other region in the country. So what's a family apple? That's an apple chosen by a small group of people as something that's important to them and passed on. They never went in the nursery trade, but in Georgia they saved Virginia they saved Davidson Sweeting. In Alabama they saved an apple outside of Mobile called Divine, which was after a family named Divine. In North Carolina, only Chatham County is the only place they grew Aunt Sally. And Lee Calhoun was one who found that apple and put it back into the nursery trade. And I think about, does the world really need the Aunt Sally apple? Is it any tastier than a Honeycrisp or a Sweet Tango, those apples with the stripper names that we have today, Cosmic Crisp. But if you ask somebody in Caswell County or Chatham County who grows Aunt Sally, is that important to them? They'll say, oh, yeah, hell yeah, it is. This apple, I can't live without this apple. So today we judge things by, on a commercial basis. The university that developed Honeycrisp has made $18 million on their U.S. patent, and their European patent is still active. So that's the business of apples now. But for 300 years, apples were not that kind of business in the South. They were woven into history and culture. And I think they matter for many reasons. You ask people in Tennessee, can they live without limber twig apples? Oh, no. And in Stewart, Virginia, they can't live without a Virginia beauty.
So I'm going to answer my own question too, about boarding houses, because you touched on it there. So I don't actually think the legacy of boarding houses is bed and breakfasts. I have a feeling that that's a bicentennial kind of phenomenon where we got real nostalgic about a kind of imagined colonial US and celebrated it. But what I do think the legacy of boarding houses is that if you have a side hustle, if you are not quite sure that that you could walk into a bank and get your idea funded, if you know you've got a family or a family of choice, or a family you're hoping to draw together, a group of friends you're hoping to draw together, if you feel like, you know what, I don't just want to do something just for myself, I want to do something in community, in conversation, you are standing in the legacy of boarding house keepers. There's something so profound about this group of largely women through time who couldn't walk into a bank, who didn't have formal recognition or capital, but said, you know what, I've got a little bit of space, or I can cook a little bit, or I know how to do laundry, or you know what, yeah, okay, so I was sleeping in that room, and then my aunt was in the other room, and I had 2 kids over there, but you know what, we could all just pitch in together, and it's the resort season, and you know what, we could make some support for ourselves. And then maybe what we're doing, it turns out I'm really good at this, and I know how to organize, and I know how to think about growing what I am doing in a way that is really sustaining, and that is helping other people in my community come along. All of that is the boarding house. And so that to me is something that I keep in my head as a little bit of an inspiration and a little bit of a message that we can figure this out. We can figure this out in this moment. I teach students who sometimes are thinking, but I may have some debt here, I'm not quite sure what my next job is, but they're also thinking, I can monetize this, I can do that, I have this skill, I can make that, I can come back around, I could maybe have some apple trees, I could figure out what I am going to weave together to make some support. And that's really powerful and something we ought to pay some attention to.
Kirk, we're over at Botanist and Barrel today. We had an industry event and cider tasting with some cider makers and wine people and beverage people. And Botanist and Barrel, which is a very significant cidery, great cidery here in North Carolina. It started as a side hustle. They thought they were going to make like 500 gallons a year. And they're just going to do it on the side, and they're now making 50,000 a year or something like that. A lot of cider. So yeah, I hear that. Maybe we ought to take questions.
Sure, got some time. We'll just do virtual and live, one then the other. Would somebody live like to kick us off, please?
Thank you all for what you're doing and the points you're raising. Obviously, women figure very prominently in your book. What about women in orchards and ethics?
I had a feeling this question was coming, and boy, that's one of the ones that's hard to know. And sometimes it's often obvious that they did a great deal, but sometimes it's never written about. And I'll just quickly tell the story of Henderson Llewellyn, Guilford County Quaker whose family had nurseries, quite many Quaker nurseries in Guilford County, very famous area. He was an abolitionist. He and his family moved westward and westward and westward. He ended up in Iowa, had nurseries, and decided to take his family on the Oregon Trail with 700 apple trees in a wagon, pulled by 6 oxen. with special soil that he came up with that had charcoal. I mean, this guy was a nut. So he read this account. He's like, we're going. So he had 26 people and a whole bunch of wagons. And they started out across the country with 5 children and a pregnant wife. And one of the sons wrote memoirs, and that's how we wrote a memoir. That's how we know a lot about this. And he talks about as a little 7-year-old having to water the apples sometimes twice a day as they went across the plains. They were very slow. They had to, take the wagons apart when they forded real big rivers. In July, they crossed the Rockies and encountered snow. They come to the Columbia River. They have to spend 2 months building barges, put all this stuff on and go down the rapids. It hasn't been dammed, go down. They land outside of Portland and move into a log cabin. And his wife gives birth to their 6th child 2 days later. Well, what do you think she did on that trip? I mean, she, was a huge part of that endeavor of getting that family across the country. He, a year later, he of course dug the trees in, covered them up with soil to let them go over the winter. The next spring, farmers in this fruit-hungry territory would travel 100 miles on horseback to buy those trees. He founded the Pacific Northwest apple industry, and his wife was a big part of that. And his little baby, Columbia, Oregon, Llewellyn, was a part of it too, and we don't know her story, so it's there, but nobody wrote about her. I read 3 or 4 books about Henderson Llewellyn. They never mentioned his wife except she was pregnant and she had a baby. That was it.
Is there another question from the from the live audience? Not the virtual audience, I'm looking at you. They're a little shy. So, you can take another one.
Yeah, I have a question. As writers, when you mentioned one of the stories in the boarding house things, that there were like breadcrumbs of little thing. So where do you draw the line between creative nonfiction and sort of filling in that and creating something and then keeping it just breadcrumbs and just factual? How do you decide how to do that?
That's a wonderful question. It's one that I struggle with. I do not want to add details that I don't know. So I do want to mark where there's a silence. And I think that can be really powerful as writers if we say, the story takes us this far and then it falls silent. But at the same time, particularly for this project, I wanted to, rather than leading with the theme or the idea or the nuance, I wanted to start with the women's stories. I wanted to let the pieces of their voice that we have in the archive, in people's storytelling, in songs, in poems, in diaries, I wanted that to show. And then, especially when there are places where we don't have the full story, I want to let those women stand with other women who might have been on a parallel path. And so that I think then allows that kind of richness around it. I will say though, that one of the things that for me, so I'm really fortunate in kind of coming up with a PhD in women's studies, living my life in American studies departments, because those are places that really care about the wealth of evidence that we have in the United States. And so I take a couple of moments where I ran up against a topic where I just didn't have the historical figure that I wanted to spend time talking about, but I did have a novel written by someone at that time who had herself lived in boarding houses or run a boarding house or traveled and kept a diary of all the boarding houses, who then wrote about someone in a boarding house. I spend time with that. I think that's evidence. I think that matters. I think those stories are important too. I want to mark for you when I'm talking about a poem or I'm talking about a novel. An example of that is that we have one of the great pieces of evidence, particularly for the middle 20th century, are the Federal Writers Project oral histories. So the Federal Writers Project sent largely writers across the US, very accomplished folks, and said, get a picture of daily life in the United States. They spent a lot of time in the US South, and there are a lot of boarding house stories, because what were they doing? They were traveling, they were staying in boarding houses, and well, maybe I'll just talk to this person who is right here. There's a woman who did a lot of those stories in North Carolina. Her name was Travis Tuck Jordan. And she did a really curious interview with a woman who was a boarding house keeper in Durham, North Carolina. She anonymized the story in a way that she didn't do any of her other pieces. And in part, it's because the woman is very hard to understand. She had 2 children, 2 girls. She decided that one was good and one was evil. The evil one died in childbirth. Both of the daughters had 2 children. Both of them died early. So the daughter that she didn't like, who died in childbirth, her 2 children, the grandmother said, these are horrible. They have to work in my boarding house. The other 2, the children of the daughter that she liked, had a much cushier life. And then there's a moment in the oral history where the grandmother says, I couldn't do anything with my granddaughter, so I had her declared incorrigible and had her committed. So it's a kind of powerful moment, and it's not something that it just takes your breath away. The daughter somehow, the granddaughter, has an amazing outcome. She runs away from the place where she was, where she had been committed. It's probably Samarkand Hall, which is in the center of the state, down around Goldsboro, I think. But she ends up nannying for a professor's wife who puts her through library school. And so she has a career as a librarian. So not too much of a downer today. The grandmother still says, but she's still terrible. I know that she's going to hell. I know that she is not a success. I know she is terrible. Travis Tuck Jordan has in her papers, she was also an accomplished poet. And she has a series of poems about women and girls who run away from their domestic situations because they want to dance and they want to wear a pretty dress and they just can't wash one more dish. And they're written right around the same time as she did that interview. And I think there's something important about reading both of those together. And when you read them together, but you also are just acknowledging, here's what we know and here's what we don't know, then I think you have a big story.
That's very rich. But when you write about the natural world, I have the advantage of being able to locate the story in place, and I know the time of year that it happened. I know what's going on in the natural world then, and also to locate the story in time. I was very interested in this South Carolina nursery outside of Columbia and the nursery in Georgia. They both began before the Civil War. They both reopened after the Civil War. One flourished and one didn't. And I wanted to understand why. And the racial climate of South Carolina was very different around Pomaria, and a lot of violence and upset and immigration and just a very unsettled environment. Not that Georgia was settled, but it was a much more business-friendly environment. One of the stories I tell early in the book is about a very early, very large orchard in Tidewater, Virginia. The sandy soil of William Fitzhugh planted, an orchard of 10,000 trees. Well, he didn't plant it; his enslaved men and women planted it. And he was a real climber. He was an aristocrat who wanted to. He was a youngest son of a not particularly wealthy family, immigrated to Virginia with what little wealth he had, and he wanted to make a mark here. And he did that in part through a fortuitous marriage to the 11-year-old daughter of his legal client. I actually read a book, because I was like 11 years old. I knew they married young. I read a book on the marriage customs of Tidewater, Virginia. There's an entire book on that. It was called Married Early and Often. It turns out 14 was the average age, and this girl was sent to England to complete her education. But to locate, I know what was blooming the day they got married. The apple trees were blooming.
Diane, I have a question for you from virtual audience member named Charlie, and I'll read it in its entirety. Most people don't think about apples. Since your book was released, have you heard from folks whose families have apple histories, but maybe they didn't think it was important?
That's a great question. I've heard some stories, and I have to say, in every gathering, people do have apple stories. I mean, today at our tasting, someone tackled me as soon as I went in the door and told me an apple story. And I think I've heard one already tonight from someone in the room here grows apples and makes applesauce with those apples and feeds them to the bears. And I think it does connect with lots of people.
So I believe we have one more question, and then we're almost at the top of the hour to do a little wrap up. So please.
Question for you, Diane. Two-part question. So in the Garden of Eden, what apple were they eating?
Probably a pomegranate. Apples are the most widely, most geographically dispersed fruit in the world, and they'll grow in Canada. That was the story I heard today, down to Florida, but not so much in the Middle East.
Well, the second part of the question. So what are your three favorite types of apples for eating, for cooking, and for cider?
Oh, that's such a hard one. Lee Calhoun used to always say his favorite apple was the last one he ate. So I'll probably ask you about the cooking one. And you think about the different ways you cook with apples. I mean, sometimes you want them to hold together if you're frying them for breakfast. Sometimes you want them to turn to mush if you're making applesauce. So it really depends on what you're cooking. I mean, and for cider, you certainly want a complex flavor. So Honeycrisp, not so good. And Red Delicious, not so good. But any apple that's complex, that has some acidity and sugar, and the best cider is made with apples that have some tannin, because that gives it body. One of my really favorite cider apples that I'm just recently planted, still planting apples at my advanced age, is an old Southern apple called Winterjaw. A russeted apple. Parmar is an old Virginia brandy apple. Used to say if there's a Parmar in the front yard, there's a still in the backyard. And for eating, I think that's so personal, William. I like an aggressively flavored apple. I like an English apple called Ash Meets Kernel, but some of you would say it makes your teeth hurt because it's so acidic. I don't like a Honeycrisp. Honeycrisp has this special kind of cell wall called breaking. It makes breaking flesh, and it explodes in your mouth, which is a trait that has captured really the world, certainly America, and it's changed.
Pop rocks.
Yeah,
Apples.
it's a pop rocks of apples, and it's changed apple breeding. The breeders all want that breaking cell wall. It's a great question, though.
So we'll go to closing remarks from the two of you. Elizabeth, you want to kick it off?
Well, I was going to ask Diane, and then you can ask me. I think we should tell Nashville story. We're here in Nashville.
Yeah, if we can do a quick one. You go first, because mine's a little longer. We may run out of time, and you've got a really good local story.
So I might surprise people. I'm actually not going to start with Julia Wolf, although she is so important to the book and so important to the story of boarding houses. But I thought I would just talk for a moment, because I promised it early on. This is Chekhov's sex scene. Tell you a story for a moment about Lola Walker, who was a young woman who came to Asheville to stay in her aunt's boarding house for the summer in 1901, and she was a teenager at the time. She was going to help out in the boarding house. She instead had quite a active summer with a lot of parties in it. She partied at Battery Park and at Kenmure Hotel and at all around. And she met along the way a Tennessee clubman whose name was Dick Edwards. That is a hard name to research in the archives. Let me tell you, there's a lot of Richard Edwards. It's hard to nail that down. He was very wealthy, though, from Western Tennessee. And they fell in love, or he seduced her. Regardless, she ran away with him. She ran away to New York City to meet him there, where she was sure he was going to marry her. And her aunt tries to get her off the train, and that doesn't work. So she places ads in the train, in the newspapers all the way up the line, saying if you see her, get her off the train. That doesn't work either. She ends up, he doesn't marry her. She ends up joining a theater troupe, traveling the country as a chorus girl. And about 3 years later, her aunts sue him for this seduction. And he says, you'll never get a jury to convict me if we do this in my home county. So the trial starts in Asheville, and everyone is deposed. If you are from a family here in Asheville, someone in your family was deposed. There are folks from Hendersonville deposed. But the trial does get moved to Tennessee. Asheville newspapers cover it, the New York Times covers it, the Charlotte paper covers it, the Nashville American sends a reporter every single day, and it is a trial. It is a trial of the century kind of trial, and it's an amazing trial because on the stand is everyone from the boarding house, including the cook, including the person who went and got groceries, including the aunt's friend who helped out, including other girls, including other drinking buddies, including the folks who jumped into the wagon and went up Beaver Dam and got drunk. And I won't tell you the end of it, but it is an amazing trial, and the trial records are missing a page.
All right, well, I want to thank you both for being here. We're delighted to have another great collaboration with UNC Press. Thank you, and cheers.